There are lots of ways that you can add texture to your finished pieces. Hammering, roll printing, stamping, there are lots of options. I'm going to show you a series of textures that are essentially matte or brush textures that you can achieve by hand. You can also use attachments and a flex shaft to achieve some of these textures. As a rule, you should take your metal to a high polish, removing all the mars and scratches from the surface before you add the texture. At first glance, this may seem like a waste of time, but the textures we're using here don't remove scratches, and nothing will cover up a scratch, so you'll have a much more controlled and even texture if you take it to a high polish first. That way, the only scratches in the texture are the ones that you actually want there. For the purpose of this demo, I'm going to be using some copper sheet, just as it came from the supplier, so it may not be entirely free from scratches. On a safety note, you should always wear a dust mask when you're sanding metal or using a material that might throw up some particles, such as the steel wool and the pumice powder we'll be using. I won't always be wearing a dust mask in this demonstration because I'll need to talk and be understood, but you definitely should. And we will be wearing eye protection. A first really easy option for a nice texture is just plain old sandpaper. I've masked off part of my copper sample with thick postal packing tape, and I'm using a fairly coarse grit of sandpaper. It's 320. I'm using wet dry sandpaper, but you don't have to. You can sand in either straight lines or in a circular pattern. I'm going to do this one in straight lines. Start by sanding the metal in one direction, just as if you were sanding a regular piece. Rotate it and sand across the scratches that you just made. And then you can rotate it again and sand in another direction. And you can just keep doing this until you get the texture that you want. And the only thing you need to be sure is that the last series of sanding is the direction that you want your final texture to take. And I like a diagonal texture, so I'm just going to end it right here. I'm going to peel off this tape. You can get a better look at the contrast between the original metal and the textured area. I just did that to show the contrast, but that's something that you could certainly use in your designs. You can mask off part of your metal, texture others, leave the rest of it highly polished. Good grits to use for sandpaper texturing are on the coarse end, anywhere from 220 to 600 grit. This one I did with 220 grit. This is the one I just did with 320, and this one I did with 600. Other materials to use are a Scotch-Brite pad, those green scrub pads that you can buy in the grocery store, and a pad of steel wool without detergent. You'd use both of these materials the same way that you use the sandpaper, moving straight across in alternate directions or in a circular pattern. This one I did with the Scotch-Brite pad, and this one was done with the steel wool. As you can see, the steel wool gives the metal a bit finer of a matte finish. Another way to give your metal a texture is brushing. The most common tool for this is a brass brush, which is exactly what it sounds like, a wooden handle with fine brass bristles, which are surprisingly soft. You want to use the brush with soapy water, which is clean water with a bit of dishwashing liquid. You can just put that right on the brush to get started. You want to brush your metal in alternating single directions like you did with the sandpaper, or go with a circular texture. And just keep brushing. And the wire bristles will do the work, so you don't have to press particularly hard. And every so often you just wash away the suds to see how it's coming. So it'll give you a nice, what they call a brushed satin finish. So this is the copper sample that I just did with the brass brush. You can see that it's a fine, soft satin finish. You can also use a steel brush in exactly the same way as the brass brush. You use it with water and dish soap, and it'll give your metal a little bit more of a frosted look. A step up from the steel brush is a wire brush, also known as a file card, which is typically used to clean out your hand files. Use the same method as with the other brushes, and you'll get a heavily frosted, scratched surface. You want to be careful and not do this too much, or you'll chew up your surface. And with both the steel and wire brush, you should be very careful to keep your fingers out of the way. Both of these brushes are much stiffer than the brass and will really hurt if you stab yourself under your fingernail. And yes, we do speak from experience. Another method we like here is pumice powder. Pumice powder is ground up pumice stone, which is available in several grades, although jewelry suppliers usually only carry one. This material is often used in visual art. The artist combines it with a liquid medium and paints it onto canvas in layers to dry in order to give a textured surface to work on. It's also used in woodworking as a fine abrasive to smooth the surface of the wood. Woodworkers will use it with an oil such as mineral oil or paraffin to lubricate the grains. We're going to use water. So you want to combine the pumice powder with water to make a paste or slurry. There's no hard rule about the consistency here. You want enough water that you can move the granules around and not so much that it will run off your metal surface. You can apply it to the metal with a hand brush, a piece of soft felt, or a Scotch-Brite pad if you like. I'm just going to use my finger. This can be rough on your hands, so you may want to use gloves or just moisturize really well after you're done. But just pick it up with your finger and then just apply it to the metal in a circular motion. And you're just rubbing the stone in the metal, and it's just like stone attachments for a flex shaft where the stone is embedded in a burr. And this is pretty much the same thing. You're rubbing the granules of the stone into the metal to scratch the surface. And you do want to use a little bit of pressure on this. Every so often, you want to check to see how your surface is coming. Just dip it in the water, rinse it off, and take a look. So you're coming up with a really nice brushed finish there. Pumice powder, as well as steel wool, is really good for removing the patina from the high points of a patinated piece. So I'm just going to do a little bit more of this. When you're done, rinse your piece thoroughly and get rid of all the pumice granules. And also be sure to clean your hands thoroughly. You do not want to get any of this stuff in your eyes. It's not toxic, but it's really just ground up stone, so it's like really fine grained sand. So if you get it in your eyes, it will be both very painful and difficult to get out. All the methods I've just showed you are quick and easy. As you can see, none of them take a lot of time. You can also use a flex shaft to achieve many of the same textures. Sanding barrels and points, brass and steel brushes, and pumice wheels all come as flex shaft attachments.